My workplace rival smirked as I was laid off, telling me to find something I was good at. He thought he'd won. So I used my time off to report the massive security flaw I found months ago, and this morning, I was secretly hired back to fix it by locking him and the entire executive team out of their accounts. This is where the story truly begins, and you won't want to miss what happens. Make sure you're subscribed to see it through to the end. We're always curious. Where in the world are you all watching from today? Let us know in the comments. The air in the sterile conference room was thick with the uniquely corporate scent of feigned sympathy. It was a smell I had grown accustomed to over 12 years at Omnicorp, a cloying blend of bad coffee and insincere apologies. On one side of the polished mahogany table sat Linda, the head of human resources, her expression a well-practiced mask of solemnity. On the other side was my department head, Frank, a man whose spine seemed to dissolve in the presence of authority. And then there was me, Zara Vance, clutching a plain manila envelope that held the sanitized script of my professional demise. "Zara, this is purely a strategic realignment," Linda said, her voice smooth and detached. "It's not a reflection of your performance, which has always been exemplary." Exemplary? The word hung in the air, a hollow echo of the countless late nights, the weekend projects, and the unwavering dedication I had poured into my role as a senior cybersecurity analyst. I had built firewalls, patched vulnerabilities, and defended Omnicorp's digital fortress with a vigilance that bordered on obsession. But in the end, it meant nothing. I was a line item on a spreadsheet, a salary to be cut in the name of efficiency. I nodded numbly, my own voice a stranger to my ears. "I understand." Frank shifted in his seat, avoiding my gaze. "We wish you the best, Zara, truly." The meeting concluded with a handshake that felt like a final, cold transaction. I walked back to my desk in a daze, the low hum of the office suddenly sounding distant and muffled, as if I were underwater. My colleagues studiously avoided my eyes, their faces buried in their monitors. They already knew. The corporate grapevine was faster and more efficient than any system I had ever designed. My desk was an island of organized chaos in the sea of gray cubicles, a testament to a mind that was always juggling multiple threats. Stacks of technical manuals, a meticulously organized collection of flash drives, and a slightly wilting plant a former intern had given me. It was my space, my home for more than a decade, and now I had to dismantle it piece by piece under the watchful, triumphant gaze of one person in particular. Gavin Reed. He wasn't even trying to be subtle. Leaning against the partition of his own, much tidier cubicle, he had a smirk playing on his lips that made my stomach churn. Gavin was my professional shadow, a man who had built his career not on skill, but on schmoozing and sabotage. Where I saw complex security puzzles to be solved, he saw opportunities for political maneuvering. He was all style, no substance, a master of PowerPoint presentations who couldn't write a single line of code to save his life. For years, he had been a thorn in my side, taking credit for my successes and magnifying my rare missteps. He saw my quiet diligence as a weakness to be exploited, and now my termination was his ultimate victory. I started placing my personal effects into a drab cardboard box, a framed photo of my sister and me hiking, my favorite coffee mug, chipped at the rim. Each item felt impossibly heavy. "Tough break, Vance." Gavin's voice cut through my haze. He sauntered over, his hands in the pockets of his tailored trousers, the picture of casual confidence. I didn't look up. "It is what it is, Gavin." "You know," he continued, leaning in conspiratorially, his voice dropping to a low, condescending tone. "Maybe this is for the best. A real chance for you to pursue something you're actually good at." The sheer audacity of the comment struck me with the force of a physical blow. All the air left my lungs. 12 years of loyalty, of expertise, of fighting in the trenches for this company, and this weasel, this glorified salesman, had the nerve to say that to my face. He wasn't just kicking me when I was down, he was grinding his heel into my back. I slowly straightened up, my hands clenched into tight fists at my sides. For a fleeting moment, I imagined unleashing the torrent of scathing retorts that flooded my mind. I wanted to dismantle his entire professional persona, to expose him for the fraud he was, right here in the middle of the office. But then I saw the eager glint in his eyes. He wanted a reaction. He wanted a scene. He wanted me to break down, to cry, to yell, to prove that I was the overly emotional, unstable employee he had always painted me as in his closed-door meetings with management. And so I did the one thing he didn't expect. I smiled. It wasn't a warm or friendly smile. It was a small, tight, controlled curve of my lips that didn't reach my eyes. It was a smile that held a secret, a quiet promise of a reckoning he couldn't possibly comprehend. I looked him directly in the eye, holding his gaze until he was the one who shifted uncomfortably. "You might be right, Gavin," I said, my voice eerily calm. "Thank you for the advice." I turned back to my desk, picked up the last of my things, the wilting plant, and placed it gently in the box. I didn't give him another glance. As I walked toward the elevator, box in hand, I could feel his confused, irritated stare on my back. He had expected tears. He had gotten a smile. He had no idea what that smile truly meant. He and all of Omni Corp had forgotten one crucial thing about me. I was a cybersecurity analyst. I saw the hidden vulnerabilities in every system. And 3 months ago, I had found the biggest one of all, a flaw so deep and so dangerous it could bring the entire company to its knees. I had reported it, and they had ignored it. The betrayal was worse than the layoff itself. The first 48 hours after being laid off were a blur of disorientation. My apartment, once a sanctuary from the high-stress world of Omnicorp, suddenly felt like a cage. The silence was deafening, broken only by the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sounds of a city that was moving on without me. My internal clock, so finely tuned to the rhythm of early morning threat reports and late-night system updates, was completely thrown off. I woke up at 6:00 a.m. out of habit, my mind instantly starting to run through a mental checklist of network vulnerabilities before I remembered. It wasn't my network anymore. The initial shock gave way to a wave of cold, simmering anger. It wasn't just the job. It was the dismissal, the erasure of 12 years of my life as if it were nothing. It was the smug look on Gavin Reed's face, a look that said, "You are irrelevant." On the third day, my phone rang. The caller ID showed it was my sister, Chloe. "Hey you," she said, her voice warm and laced with concern. "Just checking in. How are you holding up?" "I'm fine," I lied, the word tasting like ash in my mouth. "Zara, you're the worst liar I know. You use that same tone when you tell me you like my experimental cooking," she teased gently. "Talk to me. What's going on in that big brain of yours?" I let out a long, shuddering breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. They listened to him, Chloe. They listened to Gavin. For years, he's been telling them I'm difficult, that I'm not a team player, simply because I don't sugarcoat security risks. I tell them the truth, and they fire me for it. "He's a snake, Zara. We've always known that, and they're fools for letting you go." I feel so powerless," I admitted, the words barely a whisper. "I gave them everything." There was a pause on the other end of the line. When Chloe spoke again, her voice was firm. "No, you don't. You're the furthest thing from powerless. You're Zara Vance. You're the smartest person I know. They made a mistake. A big one. The question is, what are you going to do about it?" Her words struck a chord deep within me. She was right. Wallowing in self-pity wasn't my style. I was a problem solver. My entire career had been about identifying a problem and methodically, strategically, and relentlessly working until it was solved. My termination wasn't the end of the story. It was just a new, unexpected variable in the equation. After the call, I sat at my kitchen table, a laptop in front of me, the glow of the screen reflecting in my determined eyes. The anger was still there, but it was no longer a consuming fire. It was being forged into something else, something cold, sharp, and focused. It was being forged into a plan. They had forgotten one crucial thing. This thought became a mantra, a silent refrain that played over and over in my head as I began to work. They had forgotten my expertise. They had forgotten my meticulous nature. But most importantly, they had forgotten about the report I filed 3 months ago. It was a vulnerability I'd named Cerberus, after the mythical three-headed hound that guarded the underworld. It was a fitting name for a flaw with 3 distinct, catastrophic points of failure hidden deep within Omnicorp's proprietary financial management software. One head could be exploited to manipulate payroll data. The second could access and alter sensitive client invoices. And the third, the most dangerous of all, could grant an intruder root-level access to the accounts of the entire executive leadership team. It was a ticking time bomb. I had documented everything in a 50-page report, complete with proof-of-concept code and a detailed remediation plan. I had presented it in a meeting with Frank and a few other mid-level managers. Gavin had been there, of course. He'd yawned dramatically halfway through my presentation, and then, during the Q&A, had dismissed my findings as theoretical fear-mongering. Zara has a flair for the dramatic, he had said with a chuckle, and the other managers, eager to avoid a costly and complicated system overhaul, had readily agreed. Frank had shelved the report, promising to circle back to it next quarter. They never did, and now I was no longer bound by employee contracts or corporate loyalty. I was a private citizen. A highly skilled private citizen who was in possession of knowledge that, in the right hands, was incredibly powerful. My fingers flew across the keyboard. I wasn't hacking my old employer. That would be illegal and reckless. My plan was far more elegant. I began by establishing a single-member LLC, Vance Cybersecurity Solutions. I built a professional, if sparse, website overnight. I drafted a boilerplate consulting agreement. Then, I began to compose a new report. This one was not for my former bosses. It was an anonymous, formal disclosure, written in the dry, technical language required by federal agencies. I addressed it to the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA, the nation's primary watchdog for this kind of threat. I laid out the Cerberus vulnerability in excruciating detail, omitting any mention of my personal history with Omnicorp, but providing enough information for any competent analyst to verify the threat. I submitted it through their official portal, a digital message in a bottle cast into the vast ocean of the internet. And then I waited. For a week there was nothing. The silence from the outside world was a stark contrast to the storm of activity in my apartment. I cleaned, I organized, I read dense technical journals I'd never had time for. I was sharpening my tools, preparing for a battle I knew was coming. Because a vulnerability like Cerberus, once reported to a federal agency, couldn't be ignored. It was a matter of when, not if. They had forgotten one crucial thing. They thought they had fired a disgruntled employee. They had no idea they had just unleashed a consultant. My history with Omnicorp began 12 years ago, fresh out of a master's program with a head full of ambition and a genuine passion for digital security. I was drawn to the company's innovative reputation and the promise of working on cutting-edge challenges. In those early years, it was everything I had hoped for. I thrived on the complexity, earning a reputation as the go-to person for the nastiest, most intractable security problems. I wasn't just an employee, I was a believer. I sacrificed weekends to patch zero-day exploits, canceled vacations to handle denial-of-service attacks, and poured my soul into building a digital fortress that I was proud of. My devotion was rooted in a deep sense of loyalty to the company's mission and to the people who had initially mentored me. My first boss, a brilliant but gruff man named Robert, had taught me that in cybersecurity there was no room for ego or politics. "The bits and bytes don't lie, Vance," he used to say. "The threat is the only thing that matters." I took his words to heart, and for years my work spoke for itself. I received awards, my bonuses were substantial, and my performance reviews were glowing. I was on a clear upward trajectory. Then, about 5 years ago, Robert retired, and the corporate culture began to shift. The new management prioritized optics over operations. They were less interested in the integrity of the code and more interested in the sleekness of the presentation. That was when Gavin Reed was promoted to team lead. Gavin was the physical embodiment of this new era. He was handsome in a generic, corporate way, with perfectly coiffed hair and a wardrobe of sharp suits that always looked freshly pressed. He had a firm handshake, a dazzling smile, and an uncanny ability to remember the names of every executive's spouse and children. On the surface, he was the model employee. Polished, professional, ambitious. But underneath that veneer, he was a black hole of competence. His technical knowledge was shallow at best, cobbled together from buzzwords he picked up in meetings. His primary skill was delegation, which in practice meant offloading his responsibilities onto the technical experts, like me, and then repackaging our work as his own strategic triumph. Our conflict began subtly. It started with him borrowing a slide from one of my technical briefings for a presentation to the executive board, conveniently forgetting to credit me. Then, he began inserting himself as the middleman between my team and upper management, filtering our detailed risk assessments and watering them down to be more palatable. He'd remove the stark warnings and technical jargon, replacing them with reassuring corporate speak and vague promises of proactive monitoring. I first confronted him after he presented my detailed analysis of a phishing attack as his own, receiving a spot bonus for the leadership he demonstrated. I found him in the break room, pouring a cup of coffee. "Gavin," I began, trying to keep my voice even. "The report on the Q2 phishing incident, you presented my findings as your own." He didn't even flinch. He took a slow sip of his coffee and looked at me over the rim of the cup. "I presented a high-level summary, Zara. The board doesn't have time for the nitty-gritty details. My job is to translate your technical work into business strategy. It's called management." "My name wasn't mentioned once," I pressed. "You took credit for my analysis." He sighed, a picture of put-upon patience. "We're a team, aren't we? A win for one of us is a win for all of us. You shouldn't be so concerned with individual credit. It makes you seem, well, like you're not a team player." It was a masterclass in gaslighting. He twisted my legitimate grievance into a character flaw, painting me as selfish and uncooperative. This became his standard tactic. Anytime I raised a serious concern or pushed back against his reckless downplaying of risks, he would frame it as me being difficult, alarmist, or resistant to his leadership. He'd do it with a smile, often in group meetings, putting me in the impossible position of either backing down or looking like I was causing drama. His most insidious talent was his interest in my personal life, or rather, my perceived lack of one. He knew I was single and dedicated to my career. He'd make pointed comments couched as jokes. "Don't you ever go home, Zara?" he'd ask loudly in the open plan office. Or, during a project launch party, he once remarked to a vice president, "Zara's married to her work. That's why she's so good at finding problems everywhere." He was building a narrative. I was a lonely, obsessive workaholic who lacked the social graces and political savvy to be a leader. He was the charming, relatable visionary. I was the grumpy mechanic in the basement. The Cerberus vulnerability was the breaking point. When I discovered it, I knew it was the most significant threat Omnicorp had ever faced. I worked for 2 weeks straight, mapping its every facet. When I presented it, I didn't hold back. I laid out the catastrophic potential in clear, unequivocal terms. Gavin saw his opportunity. He didn't just disagree with my findings, he attacked my credibility. He suggested my analysis was a bid for a bigger budget, a manufactured crisis to make my department seem more important. He used my own dedication against me, and management, already wary of the cost of fixing the problem, chose to believe the comforting lie over the inconvenient truth. That was the moment I understood the depth of his malice. It wasn't just ambition. He genuinely resented my competence because it exposed his incompetence. My existence in the company was a constant, silent threat to his carefully constructed facade. Getting me fired wasn't just a political victory for him, it was an act of self-preservation. He needed me gone so that no one would be left to point out that the emperor had no clothes. And when he stood over my desk with that smug little smirk, he thought he had finally silenced the one person who knew the truth. The call came precisely 9 days after I submitted my anonymous report to CISA. It was an unlisted number, and I let it go to voicemail. The message was brief, professional, and sent a jolt of adrenaline through my system. This is Arthur Finch, CTO of Omni Corp. I've been given your firm's name, Vance Cybersecurity Solutions, on a strong recommendation for a time-sensitive and highly confidential consultation. Please call me back at your earliest convenience. My heart hammered against my ribs. Arthur Finch, the Chief Technology Officer. He was a distant, almost mythical figure at the company, someone I had only seen in town hall meetings and corporate videos. He was old school, a brilliant engineer who had risen through the ranks before the Gavin Reeds of the world had taken over. He was also notoriously no-nonsense. CISA must have contacted the board directly, bypassing the layers of middle management that had buried my initial report. The bomb was ticking, and now they were scrambling to find someone to defuse it. This was the turning point, the moment to transform from a passive victim into an active strategist. I took a deep breath, centered myself, and spent the next hour preparing. I wasn't just Zara Vance, the laid-off analyst, anymore. I was the principal and sole employee of Vance Cybersecurity Solutions, and I was about to land my first client. I called him back. Arthur Finch speaking. His voice was gravelly and impatient. "Mr. Finch, this is Zara Vance returning your call," I said, my voice cool and steady. "Ms. Vance, thank you for the prompt reply. I'll be blunt, we have a situation here. We've received a credible third-party notice of a significant vulnerability in our internal systems. The details are alarming. Your firm comes highly recommended for this kind of discreet diagnostic and remediation work. Are you available to consult immediately?" "My schedule just opened up," I said, allowing a hint of dry irony into my tone that he likely missed. "I can be at your office in an hour to discuss the scope of the engagement." "Good, you'll be reporting directly to me. This matter is under strict non-disclosure. No one outside of my immediate office is to know the nature of your work. Is that understood?" "Perfectly, Mr. Finch." The trap was set. My leverage was the anonymity of my new company and the ticking clock of the CISA notification. Omni Corp was legally obligated to address the flaw, and they were in a panic. They needed an outside expert to provide an unbiased assessment, and, more cynically, to provide a scapegoat if things went public. They had no idea the expert they were hiring was the same person who had discovered the problem in the first place. Walking into the Omni Corp headquarters as a consultant was a surreal experience. I swiped a temporary visitor's badge instead of my old employee ID. I was escorted by Arthur Finch's executive assistant past the cubicle farm where I had spent 12 years, past my empty desk, and past Gavin Reed, who was holding court by the coffee machine, laughing loudly with a group of junior managers. He glanced at me for a split second, a flicker of vague recognition in his eyes before he dismissed me as just another visitor, another unimportant face in the corporate machine. He had no idea the woman walking past him was about to dismantle his entire world. The meeting with Arthur Finch was in his top-floor office, a spacious room with a panoramic view of the city. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. He gestured for me to sit and slid a tablet across his desk. "This is the advisory we received," he said, his expression grim. "It's technical, but the summary is clear. If this is accurate, we are exposed in a way I haven't seen in my 30 years in this industry." I scanned the document, feigning my first look at it. "The Cerberus vulnerability," I said, my voice neutral. "It's a nasty one. Complex, multi-layered. It requires a full-spectrum audit of your financial software source code, your network architecture, and your user access protocols." Arthur leaned back, studying me intently. "The advisory was anonymous. What are the chances this is a bluff, someone trying to extort us?" I met his gaze without blinking. 0. The technical markers described here are too specific. This isn't a guess, it's a map. The person who found this has been inside your system. They know exactly where the bodies are buried. His jaw tightened. The reality of the situation was sinking in. How could our internal team have missed this? He muttered, more to himself than to me. Perhaps they did, perhaps they didn't, I said carefully. That's something my audit will determine. I will need full, unrestricted root-level access to all relevant systems. I will also need a list of all personnel who have had access to the system's development and maintenance logs for the past year. This was the key. My investigation wasn't just about fixing the code, it was about establishing a chain of negligence. I wasn't just a consultant, I was an auditor, and I was building a case. Arthur nodded slowly. You'll have it, whatever you need. Just tell me how we fix it and how we make sure this never, ever happens again. He paused, a thought striking him, and I want to know who is responsible. Mr. Finch, I said, a cold sense of purpose settling over me. I assure you, by the time I'm done, you will have a crystal clear picture of exactly what happened, and exactly who is to blame. For the next week, I worked from a secluded, empty office they had set up for me in the executive wing. It was my command center. Armed with Omnicorp's checkbook and Arthur Finch's full authority, I was a ghost in their machine, moving silently through their servers, firewalls, and logs. It was a digital archaeological dig, and I was unearthing the fossilized remains of corporate malpractice. As I suspected, the evidence was everywhere. I found the original server log entries showing my initial discovery of the Cerberus anomaly. I found the ticket I had created in the internal tracking system, marked low priority. And then I found the smoking gun, a chain of emails. It began with my detailed 50-page report sent to Frank and the other managers. It was followed by a brief, dismissive reply from Gavin Reed to the group. Team, his email read, I've reviewed Zara's findings. This seems to be a highly theoretical edge case. Her analysis, while thorough, is classic overengineering. I recommend we table this discussion to focus on our Q3 deliverable targets. I'll take the action item to monitor the situation. He never monitored it, he had Ken the action item specifically to kill it. The email chain showed Frank and the others quickly agreeing, relieved to have an excuse to avoid a difficult problem. It was all there, time-stamped and irrefutable. Gavin hadn't just downplayed the risk, he had actively suppressed it. My first major confrontation was not with Gavin, but with Arthur Finch. I scheduled a preliminary findings review with him. He came into my temporary office and closed the door, his face etched with anxiety. What have you found, Ms. Vance? Instead of giving him a verbal summary, I projected 2 documents onto the wall monitor side by side. On the left was the anonymous CISA advisory. On the right was the internal report I had written 3 months prior, complete with my name on the cover page. Cerberus Vulnerability Analysis by Zara Vance. Arthur stared at the screen, his eyes flicking back and forth between the 2 documents. They were nearly identical. He looked from the monitor to me, the color draining from his face as the realization dawned. You, he whispered, his voice catching. You wrote the original report. I did, I confirmed quietly. And Omnicorp, we laid you off. 2 weeks after my report was officially shelved by middle management, I said, my voice devoid of emotion. I then displayed the email chain, highlighting Gavin Reed's message. Arthur sank into a chair, his formidable presence seeming to shrink. He read the emails, his expression hardening from shock to a slow-burning fury. He was silent for a full minute, the only sound in the room the quiet hum of the computer. He didn't just miss it, Arthur finally said, his voice low and dangerous. He buried it. He buried it and got the one person who could fix it thrown out of the company. Politics often trumps security, Mr. Finch. It's a common vulnerability in corporate systems. He stood up and began to pace the room. I want to call him in here right now. I want to, he trailed off, clenching and unclenching his fists. With all due respect, sir, that would be premature, I advised. Right now, he thinks I'm just an outside consultant. He doesn't know that I know. Let him continue to believe he's in control. The audit is not yet complete. The more rope we give him, the more he'll hang himself with it. Arthur stopped pacing and looked at me, a newfound respect in his eyes. He saw the strategist in me now, not just the technician. He nodded slowly. All right, Ms. Vance, we'll do this your way. What's the next step? The next step was a meeting with the very team that had ignored me. Frank, a few other managers, and of course, Gavin Reed. Arthur called the meeting under the pretense of having the independent consultant brief the team on her progress. I walked into the conference room, the same one where I had been fired, and took my place at the head of the table. Arthur sat to my right. Gavin sauntered in last, a smug smile on his face, clearly expecting to be praised for his handling of the department. He didn't recognize me at first, his eyes passing over me with disinterest. Thank you all for coming, Arthur began, his voice cold as ice. This is Ms. Vance. She is leading the external audit on our system integrity. She has some preliminary findings to share. I began my presentation, using the same slides and technical data as I had 3 months ago. I watched Gavin's face as I spoke. The initial smugness faded, replaced by a flicker of confusion, then dawning horror as he recognized the material. He knew this presentation. He had killed this presentation. When I finished, there was a stunned silence. Frank looked pale. The other managers fidgeted in their seats. Gavin, ever the politician, was the first to recover. He cleared his throat and forced a confident smile. Well, this is certainly detailed work, Ms. Vance, he said, the name still not registering. But I have to say, this feels very familiar. It strikes me as a bit alarmist. We have robust protocols in place. I think you may be overstating the practical risk here. He was using the exact same tactics, the same dismissive language. It was all he knew. I just smiled, that same small, secret smile I had given him when I cleaned out my desk. You think so, Mr. Reed? I asked, using his name for the first time. You believe my analysis is alarmist? That this is a theoretical edge case? Gavin's smile froze on his face. He stared at me, truly seeing me for the first time. The blood drained from his face as he finally made the connection. The laid-off analyst. The consultant. The report. It all clicked into place in his mind, and his carefully constructed composure shattered. You, he stammered, pointing a trembling finger at me. What are you doing here? Arthur Finch leaned forward, his voice like rolling thunder. Ms. Vance is here, Gavin, because unlike you, she does her job. She is fixing a catastrophic failure that you personally covered up. A failure. That has put this entire company at risk. Gavin's eyes darted around the room, looking for an ally, but he found none. The other managers stared at the table, refusing to meet his gaze. His poorly executed threat, his attempt to dismiss my work, had backfired spectacularly, confirming his guilt in front of the one man who mattered most. The trap had been sprung, and he was caught right in the middle of it. The fallout from that meeting was immediate and chaotic. Gavin, realizing his career was hanging by a thread, went into full panic mode. He began a desperate campaign to discredit me, but his attempts were clumsy and transparent. He sent a flurry of emails to Arthur Finch, claiming I was a disgruntled ex-employee with a vendetta, that my audit was biased and unprofessional. He tried to rally his old allies, Frank and the other managers, but they were now terrified of being implicated in the cover-up. They distanced themselves from him so fast they risked whiplash. Gavin's desperation only served to strengthen my position. Every frantic accusation he made, I countered with cold, hard data. I provided Arthur with a supplementary report detailing Gavin's attempts to obstruct my audit, including logs of him trying to access and alter the very system files I was analyzing. It was amateur hour, and it painted a pathetic picture of a man completely out of his depth. Meanwhile, my investigation delved deeper. This was no longer just about the Cerberus flaw. It was about a systemic culture of negligence that Gavin had fostered. I started interviewing junior analysts and developers on his team, promising them anonymity. The stories poured out. Gavin had routinely forced them to cut corners on security testing to meet arbitrary deadlines. He had a habit of deprioritizing any bug report that might reflect poorly on his leadership. One young developer told me, his voice trembling, about a time Gavin had ordered him to push a software update live despite a known data leak vulnerability, because a delay would have ruined his presentation to a client. He told me to just own it if anything went wrong, the developer confessed. He said taking risks was part of the business. This wasn't just incompetence. It was a pattern of reckless behavior that put everyone, the company, its clients, its employees, in jeopardy. I compiled this testimony, anonymized but powerful, into a dossier. The case against Gavin was becoming airtight. While I built my case, Arthur Finch was fighting his own battles with the board. They were terrified of the potential liability and reputational damage. Some board members, friends of the executives Gavin had spent years charming, were initially skeptical. They questioned the wisdom of placing so much trust in a single, unknown consultant who also happened to be a recently terminated employee. The manipulated loved one in this story was not a person, but the company itself, or at least the board members who were still under Gavin's spell. They were struggling with their loyalty, defending the polished image he had sold them for years. "Are we sure this isn't a personal matter?" one board member asked in a conference call Arthur had patched me into. "It seems this Ms. Vance has a motive to make Mr. Reed look bad." This was the moment for the second, more powerful confrontation. This was where I had to present the irrefutable proof. "If I may, Mr. Finch," I interjected calmly. Arthur gave me a nod. "Board members, I understand your concern about my objectivity, so let's remove my personal history from the equation entirely." I shared my screen. This is not my testimony. This is the sworn affidavit from a chief financial officer at Sterling Imports, a former client of Omni Corp. The document that appeared on the screen was a legal declaration I had obtained through a contact I had in the financial industry. Sterling Imports had mysteriously terminated their multi-million-dollar contract with Omni Corp a year ago, citing only a loss of confidence. The real reason had been buried. The affidavit laid it out in stark detail. The CFO of Sterling Imports described a massive data breach they had suffered. Their internal investigation had traced the point of entry back to the financial management software supplied by Omni Corp. When they had raised the alarm, their point of contact, Gavin Reed, had assured them it was an isolated incident on their end. He had stalled, deflected, and ultimately convinced them not to go public in exchange for a quiet termination of their contract. He had silenced a victim to save his own reputation. "The vulnerability described in this affidavit," I explained, my voice ringing with authority, "is a precursor to the Cerberus flaw. It was the same weakness in an earlier stage of evolution. Mr. Reed knew about this. He knew the software was compromised a full year ago. He didn't report it. He didn't fix it. He buried it. And in doing so, he turned a single BRIA into a system-wide, catastrophic threat that has now drawn the attention of a federal agency." The silence on the other end of the line was absolute. There were no more questions about my motives. There were no more defenses of Gavin Reed. I had presented them with undeniable proof, not just of his incompetence, but of a calculated, fraudulent cover-up that amounted to corporate malpractice. The spell was broken. The charm had evaporated, leaving only the ugly truth behind. Arthur Finch ended the call. He looked at me, his face grim but resolute. "He's done," he said, "but firing him isn't enough. We need to make a statement. We need to cut the rot out of this company publicly." He paused. "I have an idea. Every year, we have the annual Omni Corp Innovation Gala. It's in 3 days. It's a self-congratulatory affair where we give out awards. Gavin is slated to receive the Manager of the Year award." A slow smile spread across my face. It was perfect. A public stage. A a celebratory dinner, an award for the man who had nearly destroyed the company. The climax was set. The Omni Corp Innovation Gala was the company's premier annual event, a lavish affair held in the grand ballroom of a five-star downtown hotel. It was a night of tuxedos, evening gowns, and carefully crafted speeches about synergy and forward-thinking paradigms. For most, it was a celebration. For me, it was a battlefield. I arrived not as an employee, but as Arthur Finch's personal guest. I wore a simple, elegant black dress, a stark contrast to the glittering sequins and bold colors around me. I felt like a shadow moving through a world I no longer belonged to, yet was about to command completely. I saw Gavin across the room, basking in the glow of the attention. He was surrounded by his acolytes, laughing and accepting congratulations for an award he hadn't even received yet. He looked confident, relaxed. He clearly believed that he had weathered the storm, that his political connections on the board had protected him. He saw me standing with Arthur, and a flicker of unease crossed his face, but he quickly masked it with a dismissive smirk. He thought I was there as a scare tactic, a ghost at the feast. He had no idea I was the executioner. Dinner was a blur of bland chicken and even blander conversation. Finally, the moment arrived. The CEO took the stage to present the final, most prestigious award of the night, Manager of the Year. This year's recipient, the CEO announced, reading from a teleprompter, is a leader who exemplifies the Omni Corp spirit. He has streamlined his department, exceeded his targets, and fostered a culture of proactive success. It is my great honor to present the Manager of the Year award to Mr. Gavin Reed. A wave of applause, some genuine, some obligatory, swept through the ballroom. A spotlight found Gavin at his table. He stood up, beaming, and buttoned his jacket. He gave his wife a kiss on the cheek and began his triumphant walk to the stage. This was his moment, the culmination of years of scheming and smiling. As he reached the stage and shook the CEO's hand, Arthur Finch stood up from our table. He walked calmly to a secondary microphone set up on the side of the stage. The CEO looked surprised, but deferred to the company's revered CTO. "Thank you, Robert," Arthur said to the CEO, his voice calm but carrying an undeniable weight that silenced the room. "Before Gavin accepts his award, I have a special announcement to make. As many of you know, our company has recently navigated a significant operational challenge. We hired an external consultant to guide us through it, and she is here with us tonight. Ms. Zara Vance, would you please join me on stage?" A murmur went through the crowd. All eyes turned to me. I stood and walked to the stage, my heels clicking purposefully on the floor. I could feel Gavin's stare, his triumphant smile now frozen and brittle. He didn't understand what was happening. I stood beside Arthur, facing the audience of Omni Corp's finest. Gavin stood on the other side of the CEO, clutching his trophy, looking utterly bewildered. "Ms. Vance's official title is consultant," Arthur continued, his voice ringing with authority. "But her real role has been that of a truth-teller. For the past 2 weeks, she has conducted the most thorough security audit in this company's history. An audit made necessary by a catastrophic failure. A failure that was discovered, reported, and documented over 3 months ago by Ms. Vance herself, in her previous role as a senior analyst at this company." The murmurs grew louder. People were shifting in their seats, whispering to their neighbors. Gavin's face had gone from tan to a pasty white. "Unfortunately," Arthur said, his gaze shifting to lock onto Gavin, "Ms. Vance's warnings were not just ignored. They were deliberately and actively suppressed. Her 50-page report on the Cerberus vulnerability was buried by her direct manager to Av. Oid a difficult and costly fix." Arthur paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. That manager wanted to protect his image. He wanted to preserve his reputation as a leader who only delivered good news. In his ambition, he endangered our entire infrastructure, our clients' trust, and the financial stability of this company. He then looked directly at Gavin. "The Manager of the Year award is for someone who builds the company up, not for someone who is willing to let it burn to get a promotion." Gavin, your actions were not leadership. They were fraud. They were a betrayal of every person in this room. It was at this moment that Gavin finally broke. His carefully constructed mask of charm crumbled, revealing the panicked, desperate man beneath. "This is ridiculous," he sputtered into the microphone, his voice high-pitched and cracking. "She's a bitter ex-employee. This is a personal vendetta. Arthur, you can't possibly believe her over me." The public humiliation was profound. His outburst was a confession. Then came the final, triumphant action. It wasn't mine to deliver, it was Arthur's. He represented the company finally, powerfully, breaking free from the antagonist's control. Arthur Finch took a step forward, his expression one of cold, absolute finality. "Gavin," he said, his voice dropping to a low, chilling tone that carried to every corner of the silent ballroom. "Give me the award." Gavin stared at him, dumbfounded. "Give it to me, you haven't earned it." Trembling, utterly defeated, Gavin Reed placed the gleaming trophy back into the CEO's hands. "And one more thing," Arthur added. "As of this moment, your employment at Omnicorp is terminated. Security will now escort you from the building." Two large men in dark suits emerged from the wings of the stage and walked purposefully toward Gavin. He stood there for a moment, exposed and broken under the spotlight, before being led away, the entire company watching his walk of shame. The ballroom was utterly silent, the shock palpable. The king had been dethroned in his own court. The aftermath of the Innovation Gala was swift and decisive. Gavin Reed's public downfall sent a shockwave through Omnicorp's corporate culture. It was a clear, unambiguous message. The era of style over substance was over. Competence and integrity would no longer be sacrificed for the sake of appearances. Gavin's downfall was not limited to his career. The evidence I had compiled, particularly the sworn affidavit from Sterling Imports, was turned over to the company's legal counsel. Omnicorp, seeking to demonstrate its commitment to reform, initiated legal proceedings against him for gross negligence and fraudulent misrepresentation. He was facing financial ruin, stripped of his severance, his stock options, and his reputation. The man who had smirked at my layoff was now unemployable, a pariah in the tech industry. The days following the gala were a whirlwind of activity. Arthur Finch didn't just offer me a job back, he offered me a new division to build from the ground up. "I don't want you as an analyst, Zara," he said to me in his office, the view of the city sprawling behind him. "I want you as a leader. I'm creating a new department, the Office of Digital Integrity. It will report directly to me and have oversight over all technology and security protocols across the entire company. I want you to run it. Name your price." We negotiated a contract that was more than generous. It wasn't just about the money, it was about the authority. The contract gave me the resources and the power to ensure that a cover-up like the one Gavin had orchestrated could never happen again. I had gone from being fired to being one of the most powerful voices in the company. My first act as the new senior director was to promote the young, honest developer who had given me the testimony against Gavin. I put him in charge of a new team dedicated solely to proactive threat hunting. I reinstated the rigorous security protocols that Gavin had dismantled and began the long, complex process of remediating the Cerberus flaw. About a month later, Arthur and I had a final meeting to close out my official, consulting engagement. He handed me a check for my services, the final payment on an invoice that was, by itself, more than my previous annual salary. "I want to apologize, Zara," he said, his sincerity evident. "Not just for what Gavin did, but for the system that allowed him to do it. I let things slide. We valued the wrong metrics. You leaving and then coming back the way you did was the wake-up call this company desperately needed." "We all make mistakes," I replied. "The important thing is to learn from them." He nodded, a rare, small smile touching his lips. "Well, you certainly taught us a lesson we won't soon forget." That evening, I went home to my quiet apartment. It no longer felt like a cage, it felt like a home. The silence was no longer deafening, it was peaceful. I looked at the wilting plant I had taken from my old desk. In the past month, I had been watering it, giving it sunlight. New green shoots were beginning to emerge from the dry soil. A sense of profound peace washed over me. It wasn't the triumphant thrill of revenge. It was deeper than that. It was the quiet, solid satisfaction of justice served. I hadn't just won, I had rectified a wrong. I had exposed a dangerous fraud, and in doing so, had protected the company and the people within it that I had once cared so much about. Gavin Reed had told me to find something I was actually good at. In the end, I had done just that. I was good at seeing the truth, even when it was hidden. And I was even better at making sure that truth came to light.